Hey guys, today I'll show you a zombie horror thriller TV series named The Walking Dead-Daryl Dixon, Season 2. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The story picks up right where the previous season left off. While searching for Daryl, the elderly woman Carol encounters a bearded man riding a beardless motorcycle. He casually mentions that he got the Tesla bike from a repair shop up ahead. Carol refrains from charging in and instead scouts the shop from a hill, observing the situation and counting the people inside. After assessing the numbers, she rolls the bike down to the shop and claims she was sent by the bearded man to get it fixed. The mechanic instantly recognizes the motorcycle, but regrets that no one there knows how to repair it. Carol seizes the opportunity to ask about the bike's previous owner, hoping he might know more. Another mechanic remarks that the previous owner, Daryl Dixon, left behind the crossbow in his hand. Carol's heart sinks at the mention of Daryl, but she keeps her composure. When the mechanics aren't paying attention, she grabs the crossbow and demands to know where Daryl is. Detecting mockery in their eyes, Carol doesn't hesitate to teach them a lesson, quickly overpowering them and forcing them to talk. They reveal that Daryl was taken to France on a ship used by the corpse retrieval team. Without hesitation, Carol takes one of the shop's vehicles and rushes to the docks, only to find them abandoned and the coastline receded far into the distance. Frustrated but undeterred, her search for Daryl hits another roadblock. As she considers going back to interrogate the mechanics for more information, a small plane suddenly streaks across the sky. Overcome with excitement, she fails to notice the walker ahead in the road, causing her car to lose control and crash into a tree. The loud crash attracts nearby walkers, but Carol, undaunted, quickly draws her blade and takes them out with ease. Determined to find the plane, which could be her only way across the sea to France, Carol wanders through an abandoned park. After circling aimlessly, she hears the familiar roar of the plane's engine again, this time spotting its landing direction. Under the cover of night, she sneaks toward a nearby farm, its perimeter protected by barbed wire, a clear sign of habitation. Observing the farm from the shadows, she sees only one man inside and decides against storming in. Instead, she follows the fence line to the gate, planning to knock. However, a rabbit suddenly triggers a hidden mechanism, revealing a trap. Spotting an opening, Carol crawls through the trap, pretending to be caught. The noise brings the man running to investigate. Seizing the chance, Carol plays the victim, claiming she crashed her car and needs medicine. The man, kind-hearted but cautious, buys her story and lets her into the farm but confiscates her weapons. He allows her to tend to her wounds, with the condition that she leaves first thing in the morning. Later, in a storage shed, Carol finally lays eyes on the plane she had been longing to find. The man, the farm's owner, explains that flying is his hobby, and he takes a daily loop around the area. Holding back the urge to take the plane by force, Carol probes him further, asking what's the point of flying around here all the time, and if he hadn't thought about going somewhere farther. The man shakes his head, explaining that he has something more important to protect here. As he speaks, he suddenly remembers something and rushes to the adjacent greenhouse. Carol grows suspicious. The next day, as the man takes off in the plane, Carol sneaks over to the locked greenhouse. Peeking through the glass, she finds nothing unusual. She then checks a nearby workshop and discovers a map on a shelf. Seeing France marked as Daryl's destination, she feels an intense urge to leave immediately. Just then, the lights flicker and the farm's power goes out. The electronic locks on the greenhouse doors disengage, and Carol hesitates. She considers restoring the power, but then thinks, this is the perfect time to investigate the mysterious greenhouse. However, she has overlooked the dead walkers gathering at the farm's perimeter. Without the electric fence to keep them out, they begin to pour in, an unstoppable tide heading straight for her. While inside the greenhouse, Carol was deeply disappointed. Apart from the lush greenery, all she found was a small grave which appeared to belong to the farm owner's son. She picked up a music box nearby, and the tune it played reminded her of her late daughter. Lost in grief, she failed to notice the walkers outside the greenhouse. By the time she realized it, it was too late to escape. The greenhouse had only one exit, and she was forced to retreat as the walkers closed in. Their numbers kept growing, and she eventually found herself cornered between several plant racks. Staying calm under pressure, Carol climbed up the metal frame and managed to escape through a skylight on the roof. Just as she got out, the farm owner returned, and the two worked together not to exchange their hormones, but to quickly eliminate the walkers that had infiltrated the farm. The man looked at the mess in the greenhouse and yelled at Carol to leave immediately. Feeling guilty, she promised to clean up the bodies before leaving. Yet seeing the pain etched on the man's face, she couldn't help but ask about his past. It was, after all, the first step toward building trust. Perhaps the man had been lonely for too long because, surprisingly, he began to open up. He introduced himself as Ash and shared his story of raising his son alone until the boy was 7. Tragically, due to his own negligence, his son had been killed by walkers. Ash was consumed with guilt over failing to protect him. In the years that followed, he scavenged parts and built an airplane because his son's biggest dream had been to fly among the clouds. Hearing this, Carol felt even more remorseful. Not only did she clean up all the walkers, but before leaving, she also repaired the greenhouse. Ash no longer resented Carol and even invited her to stay for dinner and leave the next morning. Later that evening, Carol noticed a rose on the table, and her thoughts drifted to the time when Daryl had given her one to comfort her after she lost her daughter. Her face once again betrayed her sadness. Sensing something was amiss, Ash asked if she was looking for her family. Carol slowly recounted her story. The part about her bond with her daughter was true, but what followed was a mix of fabrications. She claimed that her daughter had been taken to France by an untrustworthy father, and the outbreak had severed all ties between them. Picking up on her hints, Ash asked if she wanted him to fly her to France. Carol nodded, asking if he would do whatever it took to find his family if his son was somewhere far away, with no news of his whereabouts. Ash didn't respond and instead walked out of the room. The next morning, Carol packed her weapons, preparing to leave. She desperately needed the plane, but she couldn't bring herself to force Ash to help. However, as she left the farm, Ash drove after her and caught up. Understanding the pain of losing a child, he decided to help Carol search for her daughter. Back at the farm, Ash pulled out a map and began plotting a course to France. Carol calculated the distance and asked if they had enough fuel for this journey. Ash led her to a storage room filled with barrels of ethanol. Over the years, when he wasn't tending to his crops, he had been making fuel for the plane. Carol still found it hard to believe Ash was truly willing to leave this place behind. But Ash had made up his mind, saying, "It's time to let go of everything and see the world. Otherwise, he would just die here eventually." That night, Ash and Carol prepared everything for their departure, planning to set off at dawn. Suddenly, lightning flashed across the sky, striking the wind turbine and causing it to explode. The resulting sparks ignited the ethanol storage nearby, creating a massive blast that immediately attracted hordes of walkers pouring in through the now open gate. Knowing they couldn't wait any longer, Ash decided it was time to leave. True to her nature, Carol wasted no time. After helping Ash protect the propellers and ensure the plane could safely take off, she jumped into the co-pilot's seat. As the plane began to accelerate, the approaching walkers posed no threat. With Ash's expert handling, the aircraft soon soared into the sky, leaving the chaos far below. Still a little uneasy on her first flight, Carol hesitated, but Ash encouraged her to open her eyes and look out at the horizon. The brilliant sunlight broke through the clouds, and Carol silently whispered to herself she was coming to her friend. Little did she know Daryl, who was already in France, was about to face an unprecedented danger. Daryl had been convinced by Sister Isabel to bring their savior, Laurent, to the rebel headquarters. Over the past few days, he had been teaching them survival skills for the apocalypse. However, his actions had drawn the ire of the rebel leader, who believed that Laurent, as the spiritual leader of the future, should focus his energy on studying philosophy and literature rather than on fighting and survival. Sensing the leader's growing hostility, Daryl realized there was no reason for him to stay. Perhaps it was time to head back home and reunite with his friends. Unfortunately, Atlanta was thousands of miles away, and he needed the right resources to make the journey. Before he could leave, bad news arrived. 3 rebel scouts stationed in Paris had gone missing. Among them was a scout who had once helped Daryl escape from local captors. It was suspected that they had fallen victim to retaliation by the local factions. Using their extensive intelligence network, the rebels quickly confirmed that the captured fighters would be transferred from their current location in 2 days. Upon learning this, Daryl volunteered to join the rescue mission. 2 days later, the rebel team set an ambush along the convoy's route. The original plan was to detonate landmines and attack amidst the chaos. However, when the transport trucks arrived, the mines failed to detonate. The squad leader was ready to call off the operation, but Daryl ignored the order and charged ahead, taking out the driver of the lead truck with a single shot. With no other choice, the rest of the rebel fighters joined the fray. After a fierce battle, the convoy guards were eliminated, and Daryl successfully rescued the scout who had once saved him. As the dust settled, the ruins suddenly stirred with movement. To Daryl's shock, he recognized the figure emerging from the rubble. It was Madame Janae, a powerful local warlord he had encountered before. Without hesitation, Daryl raised his rifle, ready to pull the trigger. But before he could, an explosion from the still-active landmines went off behind him. When Daryl turned back, Madame Janae had vanished without a trace. The scene shifts to Carol and Ash flying to France when a fuel leak forces them to make an emergency landing on an uninhabited island. While Ash gets to work repairing the plane, Carol takes it upon herself to clear the surrounding area of walkers. She's done this countless times before and assumes it will be a straightforward task. However, unfamiliar territory proves treacherous as moss-covered walkers lying hidden in the soil ambush her. Caught off guard, she's knocked to the ground, but Ash arrives just in time to save her. Together, they take down the remaining walkers, only to hear a gunshot in the distance. To their surprise, two women step forward, having come to their aid. The four quickly introduce themselves. The women, who introduce themselves as Anne and Hannah, explain that they used to be meteorological station staff and have been stranded here since the outbreak. Excited to meet other survivors, Hannah enthusiastically invites Carol and Ash to their home. Though Ash is preoccupied with fixing the plane, he agrees after finding a roll of duct tape. Anne insists on accompanying him to help with repairs and spends the walk questioning him about his life. When she learns about the tragic death of his only son, her face fills with pity and sorrow. Ash, however, feels uneasy, sensing something strange about her demeanor. Meanwhile, back at the station, Carol finds herself equally unsettled by Hannah, whose thoughts shocks her. Hannah believes that humanity has been poisoning the earth for centuries and that the Walker virus might be nature's way of cleansing itself. Appalled, Carol fires back, asking if her loved ones think the same thing when they died. During dinner, Hannah asks to see Carol's crossbow. Though she agrees readily, Carol quietly grips a pen in her palm, sensing trouble. Her instincts prove correct. Hannah suddenly points the crossbow at her. It turns out she lost a coin toss to Anne and was forced to follow through on the plan. Despite her hesitation, she feels bound to her partner's decision. Carol, however, grows suspicious, wondering if this means Anne plans to kill Ash. Hannah denies it, but as Ash works on the plane repairs, Anne casually asks him if he wants to have more children with her. Ash freezes for a moment, instinctively shaking his head, showing no interest in her body. Anne responds coldly, saying if everyone thought like him, then the world really would be doomed. It becomes clear that Anne's perspective is the polar opposite of Hannah's. Her goal is to preserve the earth and humanity at all costs. Ash, eager to avoid the conversation, excuses himself to find Carol. But Anne blocks his way using her sexy body, raising her rifle and claiming that the troublesome woman is probably already dead. What Anne doesn't anticipate, however, is that Carol's wit matches her fighting skills. A few sharp words leave Hannah so stunned she can't pull the trigger. Just then, Anne walks in carrying her rifle. Seeing that Hannah hasn't acted, she decides to kill Carol herself, but before she can, an arrow from the crossbow strikes her squarely in the head, sending her to meet zombie Satan. At that moment, Hannah makes her decision. She'll leave the island with Carol. It turns out her thoughts were fundamentally opposed to Anne's all along, and the fact that they managed to live together for so many years was nothing short of a miracle. As the two approached the takeoff location, a signal flare flew through the air and struck Hannah in the neck. It turned out Ash, thinking Carol was being coerced, had fired the shot using his signal gun. Carol was heartbroken but couldn't blame him. He had only acted to protect her. With the plane repaired, there was no reason for the two of them to linger any longer. After a night of flying, they finally reached the skies over Paris. Carol directed Ash to land the plane at a remote farm. Ash insisted on accompanying her to search for her daughter, but overcome with guilt, Carol firmly refused. She didn't want Ash to discover that she had lied to him. Besides, the plane needed someone to keep watch over it. Agreeing to meet again in 2 weeks, Carol shouldered her rifle and left on her own. Paris, once a bustling metropolis, was now overrun with weeds. Only the grand landmarks stubbornly clung to their former glory, defying the ravages of time. As Carol wandered through a dilapidated street, she unexpectedly heard the sound of an engine. Hiding in the shadows, she spotted 2 soldiers forcing a homeless man into their truck. Taking the opportunity, she tore a hole in a sack of grain aboard the vehicle. As the truck drove off, Carol calmly followed the trail of spilled grain. She didn't worry about finding Daryl. So long as she found people, she'd get the answers she needed. The truck led her to a plaza where the soldiers were distributing food to survivors. Mimicking the others, Carol surrendered her weapons and successfully blended into the crowd of vagrants. However, she soon realized something was wrong. After handing out food, the soldiers began rounding up the homeless and forcing them into trucks. Before Carol could escape, she was surrounded and ushered aboard along with the rest. To her slight relief, Carol found herself seated next to a teacher who spoke fluent English. He explained that the soldiers worked for Madame Genet, who claimed to be building a new nation, and viewed the wandering survivors as critical to her plans. Shortly after, they arrived at a heavily guarded fortress. The teacher became alarmed when he saw that the vehicle carrying his colleagues had taken a different route. He began shouting frantically, but was quickly silenced and pushed back by the guards. Carol sensed that things were far more sinister than the teacher realized. Meanwhile, deep in the castle's underground chambers, the soldier in charge of the operation reported to Madame Genet that they had brought back 62 more people this time, and if it was time to move forward with the plan. Madame Genet didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to a tattooed man standing nearby, the same man who had previously helped Daryl and Laurent escape. A true fighter, the man endured Madame Genet's brutal interrogation without revealing the location of the rebels' base. At the rebel headquarters, Laurent, regarded as a savior by many, struggled to fit in. Although he had been there for months, the boy only seemed truly free and happy in the presence of Daryl and sister Isabel, who had raised him. Together, the three of them, playing and laughing, resembled a family enjoying a rare moment of peace. However, the rebel leader watched this scene from afar, and his disapproval was palpable. He quickly summoned Laurent back to her side. It was time for Laurent to study literature, but Daryl could sense the leader's growing animosity. He suggested to Isabel that they take Laurent to Alexandria, where he and his friends could protect him. But Isabel believed that the rebel headquarters offered Laurent the best environment for growth and flatly rejected Daryl's proposal. The following morning, chaos erupted. Laurent had gone missing. A guard, clearly shaken, explained that a tattooed man had knocked him out and taken the boy. The leader immediately suspected Madame Genet's involvement. Daryl gathered a team and prepared to set out, desperate to rescue Laurent. They needed to reach Paris and save the boy before nightfall. While passing through a forested area, Daryl noticed empty fuel barrels along the roadside and speculated that the bandits might be nearby. Leading his group, he began a search and soon arrived at an abandoned factory. As they stepped inside, sounds from the upper floors alerted the group to movement above. Daryl, confident they had found their targets, ordered everyone to split up and surround the area. Meanwhile, at the rebel base, another survivor from the Abbey noticed a maid preparing Laurent's favorite meal. Suspicious, she quietly followed the maid, watching as the maid stealthily approached a watchtower and left the food there before hurrying away. Her suspicions deepened when she entered the watchtower herself and discovered Laurent tied up inside. It turned out that the rebel leader had orchestrated this entire situation to lure Daryl into a trap. Meanwhile, Daryl remained unaware that he was walking straight into an ambush at the abandoned factory. Daryl, leading two others, made his way to the second floor. Suddenly, the rebel fighters behind them drew their weapons. When Daryl tried to fight back, he realized that his gun had been sabotaged and was forced into close combat. Hidden soldiers on the upper level revealed themselves, but Isabel arrived just in time, shooting down the attackers and recognizing them as rebel members. She immediately realized the gravity of the situation. Meanwhile, downstairs, another member of Daryl's group was ambushed. Although he managed to take down one enemy with his bow, another tackled him to the ground. The man's companion, however, stood frozen in place, unmoving. It was clear he had already been brainwashed by the rebel leader. The rebels' plan wasn't just about killing Daryl. They intended to perform a ritual on Laurent to determine if he was truly the savior they believed him to be. Daryl arrived just in time to learn that Laurent was to be bitten by a walker, and if he survived, it would prove his divine status. Daryl refused to stand by and let this happen. Teaming up with the comrade, he managed to subdue the traitor among them. Isabel, furious at the betrayal, wasted no time in pulling the trigger and killing the traitor. When the three returned to the rebel base, night had already fallen. Storming in would be too dangerous, so they decided to wait for high tide when the guards would be forced to retreat. Isabel, racked with guilt over delivering Laurent into danger, vowed to rescue him at all costs, even at the expense of her own life. When Daryl repeated his earlier proposal to return to Alexandria together, Isabel no longer refused. Her actions spoke louder than words. The scene flashes back to the day of the Walker outbreak in France, when Madame Genet was just a janitor working in the Louvre. As she finished her shift and prepared to head home, the police suddenly sealed off the museum's exits. Moments later, the sound of walkers echoed across the square, mingling with the terrified screams of fleeing crowds. Watching from behind the glass, Madame Genet and her boyfriend exchanged tearful glances. Before they could process what was happening, a walker crashed into the glass and attacked her boyfriend. She could only watch in horror as he died before her eyes, her chicken screams drowned out by despair. Later, she returned to the gallery and stood silently before the Mona Lisa, tears streaming down her greasy face. Now, years later, she and Carol stood together before the same painting. Overwhelmed with emotion, Madame Genet reflected on how the authorities had prioritized protecting the artwork over saving human lives during the outbreak. That moment had solidified her resolve to create a new order, one where people's lives came first. Sitting across the table, Carol was bewildered by Madame Genet's story, unsure of what to make of the woman. Her confusion only deepened when a soldier angrily threw his plate of food to the ground, complaining about the quality. Madame Genet, stern-faced, ordered him to eat the spilled food off the floor, declaring her disdain for wasting resources. Faced with her overwhelming authority, the soldier reluctantly obeyed, bowing to the floor to eat. In that moment, Madame Genet's power and control were on full display, leaving Carol with a clearer understanding of who she was dealing with. The next morning, Carol was assigned to work in the kitchen. While there, she noticed several individuals being escorted into a passageway. A teacher who had been accompanying her quickly pulled her aside to hide and observe. Through a crack in the door, they saw soldiers executing the prisoners before a scientist in a lab coat injected an unknown substance into the bodies. Within seconds, 2 of the corpses transformed into walkers and lunged at the guards, while the remaining bodies remained motionless. The teacher speculated that this was part of a drug experiment, hinting at rumors that the rebels were developing a substance to make walkers both more aggressive and controllable. Worried that Daryl might become one of their test subjects, Carol threw caution to the wind. While delivering food, she boldly asked everyone she encountered if they had seen an American man named Daryl. Eventually, she came across the tattooed man who had been brutally beaten. Through tears, Carol claimed to be Daryl's long-lost sister and provided several personal details about him to earn the man's trust. Moved by her words, the tattooed man admitted that Daryl was being held in a castle on the Normandy coast. After learning the exact route to the castle from the teacher, Carol decided to set off that evening. The teacher declined her invitation to join, saying he needed to stay and look for his companions. They parted ways, and Carol knocked out a guard under the cover of darkness. However, after searching the camp, she couldn't find the car keys and was forced to steal a white horse to escape. Just as she approached the camp's exit, she was ambushed by a group of guards who had been lying in wait. To her dismay, it was the teacher who had betrayed her, hoping to save his own skin. While disappointed, Carol didn't feel anger. She knew all too well that she herself was full of lies. When brought before Madame Genet, Carol immediately began her performance. She claimed that she had been searching for Daryl because she and he had an irreconcilable grudge. Impressed by Carol's boldness and determination, Madame Genet decided to give her a chance to personally take her revenge. The teacher had already disclosed Daryl's location, and Madame Genet planned to send soldiers to attack the rebels the next day, where Carol could fulfill her supposed goal of killing Daryl. At dawn, as the soldiers prepared for battle, Madame Genet stood beside Carol, overlooking the shattered remains of the Louvre. She confided that she had spent an entire week trapped inside the palace after the outbreak, witnessing the depths of despair and the greed of humanity. From that moment, she felt it was her duty to make the world a better place, and the Walker apocalypse was the perfect stage for her ambitions. Carol listened silently, her gaze fixed on the walkers shuffling across the square below. At the rebels' fortified castle, the survivor who had uncovered the leader's sinister plot was now imprisoned in a remote courtyard. Having lived at the castle for months, she easily tricked the guards and made her way to the central square. There, she saw preparations for the so-called proof ceremony set to take place that day. Panicking, she screamed out that the leader intended to kill Laurent, calling the act pure madness. Her defiance, however, quickly drew the guards' attention. Cornered atop the castle walls, she fought desperately but lost her footing and fell to her death. The leader feigned grief, declaring that the ceremony would proceed as planned. Meanwhile, Daryl, Isabel, and their ally waited for the tide to rise, knowing that the guards would retreat from their posts. Under the cover of darkness, the group quietly approached the castle walls. Guided by their comrade, Daryl and Isabel successfully infiltrated the castle. Unbeknownst to them, the proof ceremony had already begun. The leader stood in the center of the crowd, speaking confidently. He promised to prove through his actions that everyone's faith and beliefs were absolutely correct. After finishing his speech, Laurent was brought to the center of the plaza. Having been sedated earlier, he appeared dazed and sluggish. This was the leader's method to ensure Laurent wouldn't cause trouble. The focus of the ceremony was to showcase Laurent's immunity to the Walker virus. As the crowd watched in anticipation, a walker draped in a trench coat was led out. When its hood was removed, Isabel was stunned to recognize it as the recently deceased survivor. She froze in place among the crowd. Fortunately, Daryl acted swiftly, shooting an arrow that killed the walker instantly. His action shifted all the guards' attention toward the leader, prompting them to divert a large number of soldiers to capture him. Amidst the chaos, Isabel and her comrade managed to escape with the dazed Laurent. They quickly regrouped with Daryl at a prearranged meeting spot, but the area was soon crawling with guards. With no other choice, the four hid inside a remote stone chamber. Realizing they would eventually be discovered, Daryl decided to create a diversion by drawing the guards away. He promised to meet Laurent outside the city walls and, with bold determination, stepped out of the chamber. Without the cover of a chaotic crowd this time, Daryl's escape was far more difficult. Still, his resourcefulness made every object in his hands a deadly weapon. Despite his best efforts, however, fatigue eventually caught up with him, and he was cornered by guards in a narrow alleyway. While Daryl's sacrifice successfully diverted many guards, Isabel's escape plan also hit a snag. Every few steps, they encountered fixed checkpoints and patrolling guards. To avoid raising the alarm, Isabel had to hide in a side passage. Meanwhile, Daryl was being beaten to the point of immobility. The leader approached him with a smug expression, declaring that brute force couldn't solve everything. He emphasized that Laurent's existence was critical to rallying the faith of the castle's residents, as their belief was essential for the fortress's survival. Daryl retorted that if the ceremony failed, Laurent would die. The leader revealed that if Laurent failed, he would simply try again with someone else. Hearing this, Daryl became even more resolute and refused to reveal Laurent's whereabouts. Frustrated, the leader ordered Daryl to be imprisoned. Daryl occasionally glanced at the keys on the table, refusing to give up in any situation. However, before he could put his escape plan into action, Isabel was captured and thrown into the same cell. Daryl chuckled bitterly, realizing that he had underestimated the strength of the fortress's defenses. Learning that their comrade had successfully escaped with Laurent offered Daryl a small sense of relief. Sensing Isabel's low spirits, he began describing the beauty of Alexandria, a community filled with trustworthy, diverse friends who could be relied on in tough times. While resources weren't abundant, everyone had enough to eat and stay warm. Daryl painted a dreamlike image of fireflies lighting up the riverbank at night, imagining himself taking a stroll with Isabel after Laurent started school. Isabel, lost in the vision, felt as if such a life could only exist in dreams. Daryl extended his large, calloused hand toward her, as though trying to pass on his unwavering confidence. Unbeknownst to both Daryl and Isabel, Madame Genet and her revolutionary army were already closing in on the castle. Carol glanced behind her, puzzled. She noticed large groups of civilians stepping off the trucks. Attacking a castle should be a task for armed soldiers. What could these ordinary people possibly contribute? Meanwhile, inside the castle, the rebel leader had entered the prison. Frustrated by Daryl's silence and refusal to cooperate, he decided to target Isabel instead. Daryl's anxiety grew, but with his left hand shackled, he could only watch helplessly as Isabel was taken away. Outside the castle, Carol listened to Madame Genet's rousing speech. The more she listened, the more something felt wrong. She recalled the scientist in the white lab coat injecting people with the Walker serum the day before, and suddenly realized the horrifying truth about the civilians' purpose. Alarmed, she stepped out of the crowd and confronted Madame Genet, questioning the morality of such actions. Madame Genet's expression darkened, and she quickly ordered her guards to seize Carol. It turned out Madame Genet had known all along that Carol was Daryl's friend. She believed if Carol couldn't serve her, then she would join them and become a walker. Madame Genet ruthlessly pushed Carol into the zombie horde. Sensing imminent danger, Carol instinctively began retreating. Sure enough, it wasn't long before a Gatling gun emerged, its roaring fire mercilessly mowing down the crowd. Though Carol narrowly escaped, she quickly realized that the fallen were being injected with the virus serum. Pretending to be dead, she swiftly removed the syringe from her arm, waiting for a chance to escape. However, the bodies around her began to twitch. Clearly, the serum was taking effect. Madame Genet planned to use the tattooed man to lure the newly created walkers into the castle. Seizing an opportunity, Carol made a bold move. She dragged the truck driver out of the vehicle, floored the gas pedal, and sped toward the fortress with the tattooed man in tow. The newly awakened walkers followed closely behind. As Carol approached the castle gates, she saw they were tightly shut. Fortunately, Madame Genet had prepared for this moment. A single mortar round accurately blasted the gate open. Realizing she was being used as a pawn, Carol drove into the castle. With the horde close behind, she wasted no time cutting the tattooed man's chains. To her surprise, the man willingly chose to stay behind and hold off the walkers, explaining that everything he did was for Laurent. Still confused about who Laurent was, Carol kept moving. She continued cutting down guards while frantically searching for Daryl. Meanwhile, the rebel leader was still interrogating Laurent's whereabouts. Isabelle, refusing to reveal anything, clenched her jaw and stayed silent. The rebel leader, however, saw Laurent not as an heir, but as a tool to consolidate his own power. Just as someone arrived to report that the revolutionaries had breached the castle, Isabelle made a desperate attempt to kill the rebel leader. Enraged, the rebel leader grabbed a steel rod and stabbed her in the abdomen. As the rebel leader and his men left, Isabelle miraculously opened her eyes. Perhaps driven by sheer willpower, she forced her injured body to move, staggering step by step into the chaos of the streets. Just as a walker lunged at her with a vicious snarl, attempting to have a walker baby with her, it was taken down in the blink of an eye. It turned out Carol had arrived just in time. Though she had no qualms about taking down threats, she couldn't ignore the weak and harmless, often offering a helping hand. This small act of kindness allowed her to gather vital information about Daryl's whereabouts. A guard, fleeing from walkers, rushed into the prison, only to find himself trapped with the terrifying Daryl. Having regained his freedom, Daryl fought like a man possessed, plowing through the chaotic crowd. After taking down the last guard, he saw Carol standing before him. For a moment, Daryl thought he was hallucinating, but as they embraced without a kiss, he realized it was real. There was no time for catching up as Carol quickly led him to Isabelle. Seeing his beloved on the brink of death, Daryl was rendered speechless with panic. Isabelle, however, remained calm and asked him to promise to take care of Laurent. After he gave her his word, she smiled peacefully and whispered that fireflies were beautiful before breathing her last to meet Jesus. Even though Daryl had seen his share of loss, tears streamed down his face as he mourned her. Carol gently comforted him as they fled the castle together. She told him the plane was ready and they could return home any time. But Daryl shook his head, insisting it wasn't the time yet. He needed to find Laurent first. Meanwhile, the rebel leader had fallen into Madame Genet's hands and was now her prisoner. It was revealed that the rebel leader also knew about Laurent's immunity to the Walker virus. The primary goal of last night's operation wasn't just to capture Daryl, but also to seize Laurent. The rebel leader chuckled bitterly, admitting that he had believed Laurent's escape was God's way of protecting him from harm. Now he realized it was God's way of protecting Laurent from Madame Genet. Madame Genet, smirking, replied if she found the boy, that would prove God is on her side. By this time, Daryl and Carol had reached the meeting point, only to find that Laurent was no longer there. Judging by the campfire remains, it seemed he and his companions had already left. Carol urged Daryl not to panic, saying that following the trail would surely lead them to Laurent. Finally calming down, Daryl gazed at the uniquely styled castle and muttered a French word under his breath. It was something Isabelle had taught him, meaning a place to see different things. Carol felt like she was in a dream, seeing two familiar people meet in such an unfamiliar place. As they followed the trail, they talked about everything that had happened in their time apart. Unknowingly, they wandered onto a forest path lined with colorful, impaled walkers. But for Daryl and Carol, such attempts at intimidation were nothing new. Not long after, they arrived at a human settlement and searched it thoroughly. In the basement of one house, they encountered an elderly couple having dinner. It turned out Laurent had passed through the area just the day before. With his extraordinary charisma, Laurent had quickly earned the trust and friendship of the couple. Besides Daryl, the elderly woman even knew about Sister Isabelle. Since it was too late to continue their journey, Daryl decided to rest and head out at first light. Unfortunately, the old car in the yard was no longer functional and needed some critical parts. The old man assured them they could find replacements at the nearby town and promised to help them search. As Carol helped the elderly woman prepare dinner, the latter revealed surprisingly that Laurent believed that Daryl loved Carol, but was too afraid to admit it, fearing it would keep him from leaving the community. Carol tried to respond with an excuse, but the woman cut her bullshit off with a smile, saying love isn't as complicated as people think. It turned out the elderly couple weren't husband and wife. They were simply two individuals who had lost everything and chose to follow their hearts to live happily together. Both Carol and Daryl couldn't help but admire their connection. The next day, the trio ventured into the town with the old man pushing a cart. The streets were lined with walker-filled courtyards, and the old man greeted each one as if they were old neighbors. Unfortunately, the town's only surviving residents were the elderly, and he had no way of properly burying his friends. Eventually, they reached an open garage where they found a surviving mechanic. The shop had all the parts they needed. Daryl wasted no time gathering the components, eager to get the car working so they could resume their search for the missing Laurent. The elderly woman asked Carol to help fetch some items from the storage room. Seeing the wooden door, Carol couldn't help but recall the tragic death of her daughter. Sensing something was wrong, the woman gently comforted Carol, sharing her own story of loss and how she found the strength to move on. Carol felt a sense of warmth, as if the chains around her heart were slowly being lifted. Returning to the car, she found herself bantering playfully with Daryl for the first time, prompting the old man nearby to remark that they seemed like an old married couple. At that moment, a military truck appeared in the distance. The old man urged Daryl to hide inside the car, and through the window they watched the guards question the elderly woman about anyone suspicious. She calmly brought out a dish of food which seemed to placate the soldiers, who eventually drove off while grumbling. Carol guessed the soldiers were searching for Daryl and warned him that no matter what, they had to leave by morning. She handed him an ornate toy, explaining that it was a gift from Judith. Only then did Daryl realize how many people back home truly cared about him. The next morning, as Daryl and Carol packed up to leave, the old man insisted they stay for breakfast. They agreed reluctantly, sharing a meal that included the woman's treasured truffle, a rare delicacy in these dire times. Remembering Carol's warning, Daryl quickly finished his food and prepared to leave. However, the sound of a car engine interrupted their plans. Instinctively, both Daryl and Carol prepared to flee, but were shocked to see the old man raise a rifle. Obliviously, he had betrayed them to the Revolutionary Army in exchange for better living conditions for his wife. Furious, the woman refused to go along with the plan, grabbing Carol and leading her into a nearby storage room to hide. When Madame Genet arrived with her soldiers, she immediately noticed 4 plates on the table and deduced that Daryl was nearby. Naturally, neither Daryl nor Carol were the type to sit idly by. While the guards searched, they stealthily retrieved weapons from the car. Meanwhile, Madame Genet grew impatient, threatening to kill the old woman unless her husband revealed Daryl's location. Before he could act, Carol launched a surprise attack, diverting the guards' attention toward Daryl's hiding spot. This allowed Carol to slip upstairs undetected. The old man, clutching his lover, remained frozen in place. Carol couldn't afford to stay and watch, as she had made her way to the second floor, only to be surrounded by Madame Genet's soldiers. Smiling grimly, Madame Genet taunted Carol, accusing her of taking the wrong path in life. Carol countered that Madame Genet's pursuit of power had blinded her to reality. Madame Genet lashed out, claiming that Carol couldn't possibly understand her pain, having witnessed her loved ones devoured by walkers while government officials prioritized protecting artifacts over saving lives. She explained it was at that moment that she resolved to create a new world order. Finishing her speech, Madame Genet motioned for her guards to execute Carol. Before they could act, Daryl appeared like a whirlwind, taking down the guards and shifting the tide of battle. Carol wasted no time, grabbing the virus injector gun and aiming it at Madame Genet. With one final shot, Madame Genet succumbed to the very serum she had created, dying at the hands of her own creation. Returning to the main hall, Daryl found the elderly woman had been gunned down. He and Carol solemnly buried her, while the old man wept inconsolably, his punishment far worse than death. After organizing supplies, Daryl expressed his desire to leave the area as quickly as possible, saying the longer he stayed, the more trapped he felt. Carol gave him a reassuring smile, and together they drove away from the now empty home. The walkers outside continued to snarl, but the place was already a shadow of its former self. That night, news of Madame Genet's death reached the castle. A young revolutionary leader approached the rebel leader, explaining that while they had soldiers, they lacked the ability to survive independently. The rebel leader, in turn, lacked the military force needed to maintain control. Thus, the revolutionaries and the rebels decided to join forces, forming the Hope Alliance. Their first mission was to find Laurent at all costs. However, with Madame Genet gone, a new, even greater threat was on the rise. It seemed likely that before Daryl and Carol returned home, they would have to take down this new organization. To find Laurent, Daryl and Carol followed the trail leading to central Paris. Carol, thinking it was on the way, decided to check in on the pilot Ash, an essential figure for their journey home. Upon reaching the abandoned farm on the outskirts of town, they sensed something was wrong. The barn's windows and doors were sealed shut during daylight, an unusual sight. Carol went ahead and triggered a hidden trap inside the barn. After a thorough search, she confirmed that Ash was nowhere to be found. However, at two other entrances, they found makeshift traps that had already caught a few walkers. Daryl disposed of the walkers and discovered one living person among them. Carol rushed to question him, learning that Ash had left the area yesterday and hadn't been seen since. The two quickly realized that Ash's plane must have drawn the attention of some malicious individuals. While his traps were effective against walkers, they were no match for humans. What they didn't know was that Ash had barely escaped a horde of walkers, using a broken-down car to cling to life. Daryl suggested they first regroup with Laurent, already guessing he was currently at a forward base in central Paris. Their comrade in Laurent's group urged everyone to stay vigilant, as Laurent couldn't afford even the slightest mistake. Suddenly, the base's heavy iron doors echoed with loud knocking. As everyone gathered cautiously to investigate, they were surprised to find the tattooed man, battered and bruised. Hearing the noise, Laurent emerged, reminding everyone that this man had saved him before. The tattooed man revealed that he didn't know Daryl's whereabouts and recounted how he had barely escaped Madame Genet's fortress while Daryl remained imprisoned there. Now aimless, the tattooed man saw Laurent as the only light in his otherwise dark life. The boy rushed into Daryl's arms the moment he arrived, an emotional reunion. Laurent sensed something was amiss, feeling uneasy under Daryl's grave expression. Taking the boy aside, Daryl broke the news of Isabelle's death. The boy's face turned pale as he whispered why everyone who cared about him had to die. Daryl maintained a stoic demeanor, though his heart was breaking. He shared Isabelle's dying wish to take Laurent to Alexandria in the United States. But to Daryl's shock, Laurent refused outright. The boy explained that he had already made new friends here and didn't want to leave. All he wanted was for Daryl to return home and enjoy his life. Before Daryl could say more, Laurent turned away, ending the conversation. His tone suggested there was more he wasn't saying. Meanwhile, Carol wandered around the forward base, noting how busy and purposeful everyone appeared, everyone except for Daryl, who looked out of place and melancholy. Carol correctly guessed that Laurent's rejection had shaken him. However, they couldn't dwell on it for too long. They still had to find Ash and make their way home. At that moment, the comrade brought grim news. Despite searching everywhere nearby, they hadn't found any trace of Ash. Daryl, however, had an idea. There was one place that was a hub of information. Shortly after, the group arrived at an underground bar, originally established by Laurent's father. After his death, his girlfriend Marie had taken over. Daryl wasted no time on pleasantries, diving straight into questioning Ash's whereabouts. Marie not only knew that Daryl had killed Madame Genet, but also correctly deduced that Carol had arrived in France via plane. She admitted to sending scouts to investigate the farm, but said they had found it abandoned. Then Carol noticed an oil drum on the bar counter, one that belonged to Ash. Marie immediately summoned her assistant for answers, learning that the drum had been taken from Madame Genet's former stronghold. Daryl's heart sank as he quickly drove toward the location. Both he and Carol were familiar with this place. It was once the fortress-like military stronghold of Madame Genet. But with her demise, the location had become a haven for walkers, explaining why even Marie's men dared to come here to scavenge. Daryl ventured into the familiar underground prison to find that all its former prisoners had turned into walkers. Carol inspected the bodies one by one and gradually felt relieved, as Ash wasn't among them. At that moment, Daryl glanced out of a window and noticed a car surrounded by walkers. He immediately suspected there were survivors trapped inside. Wasting no time, he and Carol armed themselves and charged into the walker horde. Within moments, they created a path and reached the car, where they found an unconscious Ash. After struggling for what felt like forever, they managed to wake him up, but it was already too late to flee. More and more walkers closed in on them. While searching the car for ammunition, Daryl stumbled across several vials of a walker virus serum. Though unsure of their exact function, he decided to take a chance. Daryl forced open the car's sunroof and fired his machine gun at the walkers, using up all the serum in the process. He retreated back into the car to await the results. Moments later, the walkers outside began reacting violently, their bodies bursting one by one in a chain reaction. Both Daryl and Carol were stunned. Suddenly, a frenzied walker broke into the car. Working together, they quickly neutralized it. Supporting the weakened Ash, the group carefully exited the vehicle. They were greeted by the grisly sight of dismembered walker corpses strewn across the ground. Daryl marveled at the serum's devastating effect, lamenting that Madame Genet hadn't lived to see it. Once back at the abandoned farm, Carol helped Ash to a bed so he could rest. His condition was nothing serious, merely dehydration caused by a lack of water. While Ash recuperated, Daryl searched the surrounding area and discovered that all the aviation fuel had been taken. It became clear that they'd need to revisit the underground bar. Carol, however, chose to stay behind to take care of Ash. In her heart, she knew there was one unresolved matter: how to confess her lies to him. Gathering her courage, Carol prepared to speak, only for Ash to interrupt her. He assumed that the daughter Carol had been searching for was already gone, and to her surprise, began comforting her instead. This only deepened Carol's feelings of guilt. Meanwhile, Daryl had already returned to the underground bar. As he prepared to ask Marie for fuel, she led him directly to Laurent. Daryl was confused, wondering what Laurent was doing here. Upon inquiry, he learned that while he and Carol were out gathering intel, the rebel leader had arrived at the forward base with his troops. He claimed jurisdiction over the base and suspected Laurent might be hiding there. Though the residents pretended to know nothing, the leader's suspicions were soon confirmed when he spotted Laurent's Rubik's Cube lying on a table. He ordered his men to search the base. As the resident's hiding spot was about to be exposed, the comrade in Laurent's group took a guard hostage, successfully diverting the attention of the rebel leader's troops. In front of everyone, the man publicly denounced the rebel leader, accusing him of abandoning the virtues of leadership and refusing to spare even a child. The rebel leader, however, remained steadfast in his belief that his actions were justified. In such a perilous world, he argued, people needed to restore their faith and hope. Laurent's existence was the proof of humanity's resilience. The comrade retorted that the rebel leader had already lost Laurent, which clearly indicated that God wasn't on his side. His words were met with unanimous agreement from the residents. The rebel leader twisted with rage, his obsession with capturing Laurent growing even stronger. While the rebel leader's attention was diverted, the tattooed man managed to sneak Laurent out of the base and brought him to the underground bar to meet up with Daryl. Hearing that the rebel leader had not given up on Laurent and had even recruited Madame Genet's remaining forces, Daryl's anxiety grew immeasurable. Once again, he tried persuading Laurent to follow him to America, emphasizing that there was no longer a safe place for him here. However, Laurent still refused, nearly driving Daryl to the brink of fury. Daryl demanded to know the real reason. Laurent finally snapped, admitting that everyone he cared about had died because of him, and he didn't want Daryl to be the next. At that moment, the commotion of footsteps erupted downstairs. The rebel leader had tracked them down. Marie quickly led Daryl and his group to a hidden passage, but they accidentally exposed their movements. The rebel leader stormed into the office and, after a thorough search, found a concealed door behind a mural. Confident that Daryl had escaped through there, the rebel leader led his men into the passage, which turned out to be an underground tunnel from the last century. The walls were made entirely of bones, emitting an eerie, chilling aura. Daryl, sensing the pursuit closing in, decided to split up with the tattooed man. The rebel leader took the bait at the three-way split, dividing his forces in half to chase down both paths. Meanwhile, Daryl hid Laurent in a secret compartment within the tunnel. The dim lighting provided him the perfect cover to launch his attacks. At this moment, Daryl was like the Grim Reaper in the dark, every strike claiming a life. By the time the rebel leader realized what was happening, he was already down to his last few men. Still, the leader failed to grasp the reality of his situation. Confident in his combat skills, he challenged Daryl to a duel. The result was no surprise. Daryl's blows left the rebel leader defeated and lifeless. On the other path, the tattooed man also didn't disappoint. He systematically eliminated the guards pursuing him and even flung the rebel leader's deputy into unconsciousness. However, thinking of Laurent's safety, he refrained from delivering a killing blow, sparing her shitty life as an act of mercy. Once the three reunited, Marie personally delivered the aviation fuel they needed. With their return to America imminent, Daryl decided to try convincing Laurent one last time. He assured Laurent that Isabelle's death was not his fault and that at his age, he shouldn't have to bear such a burden. If Laurent truly wanted to honor her, he should fulfill her final wish and go to America. Laurent finally relented, climbing into the car with Daryl. Back at the farm, Carol had finally made up her mind to confess the truth to Ash. She revealed that she hadn't come to France to find her daughter. Her daughter had died 12 years ago. Ash was devastated by the revelation, accusing Carol of using her deceased daughter to garner his sympathy. Otherwise, he argued, he would never have abandoned everything to follow her to France. At that moment, Daryl arrived with Laurent. The boy's face lit up with excitement at the sight of the airplane, but Ash immediately poured cold water on the mood, stating that the plane could only carry 3 people. This meant one of them would have to stay behind in France. Daryl insisted that it should be him. Carol knew it would be impossible to change Daryl's mind. From her luggage, she pulled out his missing crossbow, which he had thought lost. Unfortunately, the plane's weight limit meant she couldn't bring her motorcycle. Meanwhile, Ash still harbored resentment toward Carol. He coldly informed them that the fuel hose for the plane was missing. Daryl followed him to the underground garage, where Ash busied himself disassembling parts. Taking the opportunity, Daryl casually brought up Laurent's background. Learning that the boy's parents were deceased, Ash's expression softened. If his son had lived, he would have been about the same age as Laurent. Unintentionally, Ash wandered into a metal gate. Daryl yanked him back just in time, revealing that the other side was teeming with walkers. Ash's back was drenched in cold sweat. This incident seemed to shift his perspective. He promised to ensure that Carol and Laurent would safely reach Alexandria. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from outside. It was their comrade and the tattooed man. They brought grim news, saying that the Alliance army wasn't giving up and was still hunting for Laurent. Earlier that day, while the comrade had led a team to search for supplies, leaving one person to stand guard, he and the tattooed man had entered an abandoned hospital. Although the place was crawling with walkers, they were mostly frail and posed little threat. Letting their guard down, the two were ambushed by soldiers and captured alive. The Alliance squad leader emerged from a side door, demanding to know the location of the plane. The tattooed man, however, refused to cooperate. The squad leader then attempted to use their comrade's life as leverage. At the critical moment, a few arrows flew in from a distance. It was their lookout coming to the rescue. The comrade seized the opportunity to strike back, successfully driving off the soldiers. The tattooed man believed they needed to alert Daryl immediately, but what they didn't know was that the Alliance army had also confronted Marie. This time, the one in charge of the team was the rebel leader's ruthless deputy, who was even more brutal than her predecessor. She demanded to know where the plane was, threatening to kill everyone Marie cared about if she refused to talk. Remaining calm, Marie said she would take them to the plane, on the condition that Laurent would return to the Alliance and she would keep the plane and the pilot. The deputy smirked, dismissing Marie's request as the greed of a merchant. Meanwhile, the comrade sent a warning to Carol, urging her to take off immediately. Ash insisted on running final checks on the plane, saying that any malfunction mid-air would be catastrophic. At the same time, Marie led the deputy toward the farm. She knew of a shortcut that would allow them to intercept Carol and her group. The Alliance launched a full-scale operation this time, with Marie leading a large contingent of soldiers into the stadium, brimming with confidence. However, when her eyes fell upon the damaged mural, she was immediately reminded of what Laurent had once said, that the Eiffel Tower would one day be restored to its former glory. A wave of emotion washed over Marie. Deep down, she had long grown weary of this shattered world. With repeated urging from her deputy, Marie led her team into the underground parking lot. Being well acquainted with the place, she knew exactly what lay behind the fences. Sure enough, before long, the guttural growls of zombies echoed through the space, and unsuspecting soldiers were quickly overwhelmed. In the cramped chaos, her team stood no chance against the ferocious onslaught. After losing more than half of their forces, they finally retreated beyond the iron gates. Unfortunately, there was no escape for Marie. She was consumed alive by the horde. The deputy fared no better, suffering a bite to her arm from one of the undead. As despair and helplessness set in, the sound of an airplane's rumbling engine reached her ears. Seizing the opportunity like a lifeline, the deputy immediately rallied her team and rushed toward it. Meanwhile, on the runway, Ash was finishing his final adjustments, preparing the plane for takeoff, just as the vanguard of the Alliance forces arrived. With no time for proper goodbyes, Daryl urged Carol to board the plane. As their eyes met, no words or kisses were needed to convey their hormone feelings. Pushing an iron frame into the center of the road, Daryl and his comrade used it as cover, creating a protective barrier for the departing plane. On the other side, the deputy, now desperate, ordered her riders to flank them. The plane was still taxiing on the runway, making it an easy target. Daryl forced himself to remain calm, taking aim and pulling the trigger with precision. Just as Ash felt a flicker of relief, an off-road vehicle barreled onto the runway, heading straight for the plane. Daryl raised his rifle again, only to realize he was out of bullets, panic rising in his chest. At the last moment, the off-road vehicle veered off course. It turned out Carol had jumped from the plane and shot the driver with a well-placed sniper round. Daryl didn't reprimand her for the impulsive move. Instead, he watched as the plane slowly lifted into the sky, offering a silent wave, a final farewell to Laurent. Meanwhile, the Alliance forces halted their attack. There was no longer any reason to continue. The deputy slowly raised her gun to her head to end her misery. Once an unstoppable force, the Alliance was now utterly dismantled. The comrade led the group to a remote settlement, where he introduced them to a guide who claimed to know a way across the channel to England. Daryl decided to check it out, reasoning that England was closer to America and might provide a path home. Soon enough, the guide arrived and revealed that a hidden undersea tunnel connected the two lands. By bribing the guards stationed at the checkpoints, they could cross freely. As night fell, the group decided to rest for the evening before setting off. For the tattooed man, France held no attachments. Even his only brother was dead. He chose to join Daryl on this perilous journey. Daryl offered an explanation. He wasn't the one who killed his brother. It was a little girl pretending to be blind. The tattooed man was consumed with anger, recalling how the same girl had claimed Daryl was the killer. This lie had driven him to storm the monastery and force Laurent and Isabelle to flee. Daryl let out a quiet sigh and walked away, leaving the man to his thoughts. Elsewhere, Carol sat alone in a corner, lost in sorrow. She had been thinking of her late daughter, though what pained her most was that she could no longer remember her daughter's face. Daryl approached and gave her a comforting hug, reminding her that the past is the past and they have to keep moving forward. Early the next morning, the group drove to the westernmost coast of France, where the comrade escorted Daryl to the tunnel entrance. He had initially wanted to leave with them, but he couldn't bring himself to abandon the memory of his lost love. With tears in his eyes, he bid farewell to his former fellow. Daryl glanced back several times as they parted ways. As the group entered the underwater tunnel, the guide began explaining that the British military had sealed it off when the zombie virus first broke out. After walking for a few kilometers, they finally reached a checkpoint. From a distance, the guide loudly announced their arrival, but no one responded. When they got closer, they discovered the checkpoint had fallen. Every guard and passing traveler had turned into zombies. Daryl started the generator and saw that the soldiers had all died in a frenzy, killing each other. Scattered nearby were 2 gas masks, which only deepened the mystery. No one could figure out what had happened. Daryl suggested they leave quickly, but as they passed the guard post, everyone froze in their tracks. Ahead, the tunnel emitted an eerie, glowing light. Daryl speculated that it was caused by some kind of microorganism, similar to the bioluminescence of fireflies. Proceeding cautiously, the group moved forward until a sudden stumble from the tattooed man and a loud crash as the guide fell to the ground drew the attention of nearby zombies. Forced into action, the group opened fire, but Daryl soon realized something was wrong, not just with the guide, but with everyone. Their eyes began to glaze over. The glowing microorganisms had entered their systems, causing hallucinations. It all started to make sense. The guards at the checkpoint had likely killed each other under the influence of these spores. But Daryl had realized the truth too late. Lost in his delusions, the tattooed man saw the ghost of his brother and became convinced that Daryl was the one who killed him. Meanwhile, Carol froze in place, hallucinating the image of her dead daughter. She stood still, waiting for the zombies to reach her. Daryl, unwilling to engage in a fight with the tattooed man, began shouting his name. Startled, the tattooed man hesitated for a moment before seeing a vision of his brother beckoning him forward. Abandoning Daryl, he ran toward the illusion without a second thought. Daryl tried to stop him but couldn't. He remembered the gas masks back at the checkpoint, his only hope of resisting the microorganisms. Just as he bent down to grab one, he was struck in the back with a shovel. To his surprise, it was the guides who betrayed him. They wanted the gas masks for themselves, as there were only two. Drained of energy and helpless, Daryl could do nothing but await his fate. On the other side of the tunnel, however, Carol wasn't ready to give up. As the zombies closed in, her vision cleared for a moment, and she realized the danger she was in. She quickly drew her knife and began fighting back. But when only one zombie was left, she froze. The zombie looked exactly like her. Coming back to her senses, the zombie had vanished, replaced by the image of her daughter. Carol finally saw her daughter's face clearly. She wanted to follow her, but the girl firmly shook her head in refusal. Tears streamed down Carol's face as she realized this was her way of saying goodbye to her past self. Elsewhere, Daryl was bracing himself for death when he suddenly saw Isabel walking toward him. She was dressed exactly as she had been when they first met. She told him he shouldn't die here and that he should not forget the promise he made to her. Daryl's mind flashed with images of Laurent, and from somewhere within, he found a surge of strength. Picking up a shovel, he struck down the guide beside him. The guide's partner tried to intervene but was promptly slammed to the ground. As a finishing touch, Daryl shot her before taking a deep breath through the mask. Isabel's image appeared once more. She whispered goodbye before vanishing into the darkness. Daryl noticed faint glowing specks swirling around her, reminiscent of fireflies. Just then, Carol emerged from the shadows. It was only then that Daryl came to his senses. Handing her a gas mask, the two exchanged a glance and without speaking a word, headed deeper into the tunnel. And so ends the second season. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.